Welcome to Elephant in the Room, a podcast featuring real conversations with real therapists on the elephant in every room, trauma. With this show, we are aiming to share insights from professional practitioners on trauma, its impacts, as well as various modalities and resources on healing for survivors. This podcast is produced by the Breaking Free Foundation, a Canadian registered charity that supports trauma survivors in reclaiming their lives and finding healing. All of the therapists interviewed on this podcast are members of the Breaking Free Foundation Trauma Practitioner Network. My name is Amber Craig. I am a trauma survivor, one of the co-founders of the Breaking Free Foundation, and the proud host of this podcast. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Rachel Freeman. Rachel is a registered psychologist and certified clinical trauma professional at Apex Counseling Services in Red Deer, Alberta. She specializes in CBT, trauma therapy, and domestic violence treatment. Please welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Hi. Okay, so I only have one thing to say, just because it is really important. I'm technically a registered psychotherapist, so it's different than a registered psychologist. Some people get it confused because my master's is in counseling psychology, but I'm not with CAP. So I have to be very careful about that, because people get on me.
No, that is really important. So thank you for saying that. Okay, let's dive right in. So obviously starting with the super brief intro, can you please give a little more information about your professional background and the areas that you work in?
Okay, so I'll try to make this brief. I was essentially born into therapy. I am, in the sense, a Nepo baby. So both my parents are registered psychologists and registered nurses. My dad started Jim Freeman psychotherapist from the ground up. He was part of the building the domestic violence treatment in Red Deer. Part of it, he was the one who built it with help from other agency executive directors. And then my mom kind of followed suit, and she became the original therapist for our mental health program through AHS. So by the time I was 16, I was the friend who listened to all the other friends and their therapy needs. So when I was 16, I did typing for program development. I thought, this is really boring. I want to be a marine biologist. And then I realized I had to move, so I didn't want to do that. And I went to school, graduated with my degree in 2012, then my master's right after. Had my baby in the middle of that. And then I was kind of trying to find my own way in the world. I didn't want to be known as Jim Freeman and Sue Parcel's daughter. And then it kind of just came into a natural, like I fell into it. I went and got all the training I needed to get, and I was fascinated by domestic violence treatment. So Sue was running the victims treatment and Jim was running the perpetrators, so the court mandated male offenders of domestic violence treatment program, long-winded name. And so I liked that. And then I found that because there was so much trauma in both those populations, and not just trauma that's within the domestic violence dynamic, but a lot of the people we worked with came from trauma. So there's that intergenerational transmission of trauma going on, and then it cycles into domestic violence. So I went out on my own and I got certified as a clinical trauma professional for adults as well as adolescents and children. And I just don't stop learning. So I'm currently being certified in ADHD and trauma. So I've been doing that for almost 9 years as a full-time therapist. And then trauma specifically 3 or 4 years.
Amazing. So something you brought up was domestic violence, which is where I want to center our conversation today, because we do work with a lot of people that are impacted by this type of trauma. Mm-hmm. So as a very general starting point, can you define what domestic violence is?
So general. Okay. It's a hard one to answer. So when we look at just the statement or just the label domestic violence, there is this myth that it's violence. It doesn't have to be, and nor does it usually start with violence. So we look at it on a spectrum of domestic dysfunction, abuse, and or violence. We look at from the start with like coercive control, emotional manipulation, emotional dependence is a big one. So the belief for emotional dependence, the belief that anybody else is in control of your emotions, you changing them. If they say, you're the reason I'm mad, you make me angry. So that's typically where it starts. And then it goes domestic dysfunction, abuse, violence. So defining it is really tricky. You kind of, I think because of that label, a lot of people are like, well, they never hit me. Well, and we always respond back, well, they typically then they didn't have to, because the emotional manipulation and control was enough for them to get that power and control out of the relationship. So it's a wide variety.
Okay, that's actually a good segue into my next question, which is
Perfect.
what specifically can this look like? And I mean that in the sense that a lot of people listen to this podcast and they might hear something that makes something that sounds like me or somebody I know. So can you give some examples of how that might show up?
So, like the obvious that we've been taught is like the physical violence. And physical violence can also be where they don't typically hit you. It's like slamming doors, throwing things. And again, it doesn't even have to be directed at you. So being in an abusive relationship can look like somebody, your partner not having any emotional regulation. They get angry, they slam a door. They get angry, they throw a tool. They get angry, they swear really loudly. There can also be the other side of that where they get angry or frustrated and they completely like ice cold you out. So they shut down any kind of conversation. And it's not, and this is where I have to be very specific, it's not a freeze response typically where it's like, I don't know what to say. My body won't give me the words. It's a, you, can I swear?
Yeah.
You pissed me off and now you don't get the luxury of speaking to me. So I'm going to punish you with silence. Or I'm going to withdraw my affection. It can look like in the beginning and the big one, and I like to hammer this home in all of my area of professional and personal life, emotional dependence is huge. It's because it's something we were taught. How many people
Mhm.
heard from their parents, you made me mad, you pissed me off, you're the reason I'm frustrated. Um, and then the opposite of that too with the love bombing. You're the only one who gets me. It's me and you against the world. I need you. I don't know what I would do without you. Um, that I love you, and then you have to say it back. And there's that
Right.
emotional manipulation, that control over your words, your feelings. So I always say, and I've only, like I said, I've only been doing domestic violence for 8, 9 years. It seems like decades. Um, but there is no picture that I can look at, a couple I can look at and go, absolutely abuse happening until I speak to them for sure.
Mm.
But there's like domestic violence dynamics 101, the power and control tactics. So like switch and bait. So they bait you into a conversation and they switch it around and you're the problem. Gaslighting, we all know that one. That's like trending on TikTok right now.
Yes.
um, the emotional manipulation, the isolation. So making comments about how they don't like your family or they don't think your family treats you very well. So enough times that then you start to question the reality you're living in. Um, Distortion of reality. So you say, this hurt my feelings, and they say, nope, that's not how that happened at all, which is kind of like
Mm.
gaslighting. So it can look like that. And then it can look like the really obvious one, like Jennifer Lopez in Enough, where it's just there's physical abuse and there's violence and there's infidelity and there's gaslighting. So yeah, it's broad range.
Yeah. No, I still think those examples are really helpful. From your professional experience, can you kind of describe what you think the link is between trauma and domestic violence?
So I think it's, from what I've seen, it's a cyclical relationship. So a lot of people who are in domestic violence relationships, and this is a very young term, and I just learned what this is, but like situationships, where there's like no
Mm,
commitment yet, but
yeah.
you're still getting that relationship dynamic. Um, they either come from trauma, so early childhood trauma that's unhealed, they don't recognize, the impact that it had on them, and then they get into an abusive relationship and then there's trauma from that, so it's like compound trauma.
Right.
And then of course that creates trauma, and then if we don't heal it, leaving the relationship or recognize what control we do have over ourselves, our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, then we're doomed to repeat it with somebody else. So a lot of times, I've worked with so many women I can't even count, where they leave an abusive relationship and then they're like, oh, I've met somebody else. he treats me so nice and everything's so good. And then it's like, it's love bombing, but it doesn't look like love bombing. And we miss the red flags because we haven't healed or processed or looked at those, say, like more orange flags that can turn into red flags. And then it's just trauma all over again.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So again, for someone who may be a victim of
Mhm.
this type of abuse and violence, what are some of the side effects that they might be showcasing?
So, this is so many. Constantly in a state of a trauma or a stress response. So a lot of women I've worked with are like, well, I'm still functioning. I'm still showering in the morning and I'm feeding myself and I'm feeding my children and they're dressed and they're off to school and but they might look like they're on autopilot. That fight, flight, freeze, or appease. So like, yeah, constantly in a stress response is a big one. So somebody almost looks like shut down or like super neurotic. Isolation is also a big one. And this isn't like, I'm 35 now. I am comfortable in my life with the few friends I have. I've said goodbye to unhealthy relationships. So that like cognitive, rational thinking through of those relationships ending is not isolation. Isolation is like cutting people off based off of your partner's perception of that relationship. Um, People who, this isn't specific to a domestic abuse, but it's a common theme. A lot of the women victims that I've worked with, and it could be he, she, they. Typically, it's more women, will not call the police, do not trust any authoritative kind of policing services or shelters. And it's probably because they've been through some form of that before and they were let down, or their partner is giving them the perception that nobody will help them.
Right.
The obvious are bruises, covering them up, sunglasses, but again, that's not always the case and violence doesn't always have to occur.
Yeah, so knowing that violence doesn't always occur with domestic violence, what is any other myths that you would like to dispel about this topic?
This question threw me for a loop because all of them. And that's only
Yeah.
yeah, every single one. So the current political state that we're in, and I'm not going to get too far into politics, it's just there's been statements made by certain politicians that the rate of domestic violence is decreasing. It's a myth. From those of us who are on the front line, we're not seeing a decrease. And if there is a decrease, stats are so easily misconstrued. So we might see a decrease in the amount of, say, perpetrators who are attending treatment. And to be clear, we no longer have a perpetrator treatment program. It's now been moved by AHS to a different agency in the community. So there might be a trend of like perpetrators attending domestic violence treatment decreasing. But then if you follow that up the line, there's also a decrease in charges that are occurring or charges that are occurring that have the domestic violence label on them. So back when we had the treatment program, and I can't claim to know how it runs now, but back when we had it, if there was a domestic violence incident, and that again can be anywhere from uttering threats to a violent assault, aggravated assault, there was a domestic violence label put on the charge and then domestic violence treatment. And it was very specific where they needed to find that treatment or their probation officer would need to help them find that treatment spot. So we're now seeing that there's less of those labels going on those charges. There are people in places of authority, so executive directors who have differing beliefs about what domestic violence is. And I've even heard somebody in the community say that they're considering neighbor assaults or neighbor conflict as domestic violence, which would then skew stats. That doesn't make any sense
Right.
because you're not in a
Right.
relationship. Unless you are, and then yes, it would be a domestic violence
Yeah.
situation.
Right.
So that's a big one. So hearing and like us on the ground level who are working with these women, now just women that we work with in a funded program who are victims of domestic violence, it is heartbreaking to hear politicians say, well, it's decreased in severity and frequency and occurrence. It hasn't. There's actually now another shift that there's more systemic abuse occurring after domestic violence for these women. So big myth that I'd like to dispel. The other myth I'd like to dispel is that there is more mutual violence occurring in domestic violence situations. That is not what we're seeing. And there hasn't been enough of a social shift or a belief shift for that to even start to occur. Domestic violence rates are still more male perpetrators and female victims because of the power dynamic in a relationship and historically what we've been taught about male-female gender roles. That's a big one. Oh, I guess the other myth, one more myth, sorry.
No, that's good.
I should have written down my points because they just kind of is that your kids can't hear you yelling because they're asleep. Or your kids, you still woke up in the morning and you made them breakfast. All that stress we're feeling, and it's not, this myth is not to shame or guilt anybody. I have been in abusive relationships, and far too many to be even talking about, but I'm not now. That's all that matters. I've done my healing. I've watched them in my life and my family. Kids know, and they might not know the specifics or the context of what's going on, but they feel the stress. So our brains are biologically built for if you as a parent, me say I have two littles, come into the house and I'm carrying all this stress from work, which was really hard while I was working in domestic violence perpetrator treatment. And I'm stressed and like overthinking. And I walk in the door and my little says, Mom, what's wrong? Mom, how's your day? I would love to think that he cares that much. He doesn't. His brain is telling him that there's a stress response happening. What is this feeling? I don't know what it is. So he looks to his primary caregiver. What's wrong? If I say nothing, I'm fine, I've now mislabeled the feeling that he's going through and that he's experiencing in his body. So the big myth is that our kids can't tell. And if you speak to in a lot of the private sector, like the fee-for-service work I do in trauma treatment, is adults who grew up in an abusive home, a domestic violence situation, and a lot of their trauma is, I knew something. I may not know the details, but I felt it.
You mentioned something really quickly there that I wanted to circle back on, which is that you've worked with perpetrators of domestic violence as well. So, for anyone who is potentially listening to this, who is maybe recognizing now that they are a perpetrator of domestic violence, what would be your message to them?
It is okay to say, yeah, I've been abusive, or yes, I'm abusive. It does not mean that you are an absolutely horrible person. And I think that was a lot of the resistance we got from the guys in our program. So the majority of the guys that were in our program were court mandated, but there was a select few that were volunteer or referred by Child and Family Services. And the biggest first step is admitting that you've done something unhealthy, dysfunctional, abusive, and or violent. So, and not an admission with an apology that you expect to be forgiven. Just like, yep, I screwed up, I need help. And then getting down to the root of it. Honesty is the best policy always. There is help. I say this hesitantly just because I know of the situation in Red Deer right now with domestic violence treatment. So I've heard that there is voluntary spaces for guys at the domestic violence treatment. And I believe it's run through McMahon now. And then I've heard opposite too. So I'm not quite sure. I think the best thing would be call them and ask. I do see men who recognize they've been abusive in relationships, but it is fee for service. So it's not one of the funded programs. But reach out, ask for help. And then, like I said, I say that hesitantly just because of the funding. There's been so many funding cuts in Red Deer specifically for domestic violence treatment that I don't know what's all out there. And I hate to sound like destitute with that, but call, harass, AHS. Like, do you have something? Can I see somebody? McMahon, the outreach, I believe, will direct them in the right place. I've had guys call me and they're like, I can't afford fee for service. And I like do my research, who can do funded, who has them. So don't be afraid to call.
That's great. And if someone is in a domestic violence situation in general, what can they do to access help?
So there is obviously us for female victims, 18 plus. We have a funded program through Apex Counseling Services. It is self-referral, so anybody can call us up. The funded program we run is a group psychotherapy program that's a year long. So each woman entering gets 1 year in that program. There is the Outreach Center, formerly known as the Women's Outreach Center, but now it's just the Outreach because they serve a broader range of clientele. The Women's Shelter in Red Deer, and I hear the hesitation for women calling, or victims, sorry, calling the police. I say never stop calling, even if you don't get the answer that you want. That's on record. There is a paper trail. There's a phone call that's made, and so yeah, I think it's just never enough calls.
This question I think is an important one because we've certainly had this come up a lot in our monthly support meetings and in conversations we've had, where I think a lot of people will recognize that someone they care about is in a domestic violence situation, even though that person doesn't see it. And so they feel sort of like, what can I do to help? So I guess that's the question. Is there anything you can do from an outside perspective to help someone that you believe is in a domestic violence situation?
Yes and no. So yes, in being you can be supportive of them and where they're at. I also understand as somebody on the outside of a relationship that it can get really tiring having your friends say, I need to leave. This is bad. No, I'm staying. He apologized or they apologized. I need to leave. And then it's just over and over and over again. So protecting your boundaries while also trying to balance the support for your friend, for your family member. I mean, you can try a number of different things. Like I've had family members call and say, I think this person in my family is in an abusive relationship. What resources can I give them? And I always say like us or the shelter, or the outreach, right? Like there are resources. But then sometimes you get that pushback. So you present the resources and the person's like, what are you talking about? You're just judging my relationship because they're in it. They are.
Yeah.
And I think another myth quick, sorry, I want to go back to
Yeah.
the whole like, well, why don't they just leave? As somebody who's been in an abusive relationship, it doesn't start with a black eye or a broken rib. And if that was the case, then it would be more of a stranger assault if that happened on the first date. I probably wouldn't book a second one. It starts with love bombing. And that's where the childhood trauma comes in, because I was more vulnerable to abusive relationships because I had some childhood trauma that was unresolved that led to attachment trauma. So a boy called me pretty and I went, marry me, I'll have your babies.
Right.
I'll do whatever you
Right.
want, because you create a feeling that I didn't have before. Little did I know I was the one who had to create that feeling for myself in order for it to be genuine, because he created the feeling and then he took it away and then he gave it back and then he took it away. And so by the time it got to a place where I was like, there was physical abuse occurring, it was, how do I leave? And then you care about the other person. So you're like, I don't want to abandon them. I don't want to be another person who doesn't care about them, because that's the message you're being fed by your partner. I went off on a tangent. I apologize. So
No, I
that's,
think that was a really important thing to add in, actually.
when you're looking at your friend or family member, don't say, why don't you just leave? The questions are like, what do you need? You know, how can I help? I have lots of people I've worked with where they're not ready to leave the relationship, but they have like a code word with their family, where if that code word is said, call 911, or if this one said, like, I'm leaving, it's happening right now. So safety plans are huge. And if you don't know where to start with a safety plan, the outreach is a great resource for that. And us as well, like I say, so I have lots of people, even if it's not in our like funding program, whatever outline, I will never refuse a phone call from a woman who's looking for resources, or a man who's calling and saying, I think I'm in an abusive relationship, or I think I am the one who's abusive. Yeah, like I always talk to them. So
that's really
I don't know
helpful
if I answered your
information.
question.
You did. No, I think you answered it perfectly. I mean, I know the answer, but I think it's just important to always come back to that.
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing is, sorry, I think sometimes if there's children involved, we get stuck in this, well, it's their kids. So they're making the decision. And it might be easier for me to say this because I'm a mandatory reporter, but if kids are in danger, call.
Yeah.
Call police, call CFS. You can call CFS anonymously and ask them questions. And like you can ask them what will happen, what's the process? Because sometimes I think because of maybe past experiences, maybe friends' past experiences, Lord knows Hollywood and what they put on in movies and TV shows. It's a little intimidating calling CFS because we think they're just going to scoop our kids right out.
Yeah.
There has been a policy shift with them and the way that they address situations. But if you're still unsure and you're a family member and you don't want to give names, you can call them anonymously and say, this is a hypothetical situation. What would happen if I did report? And like, what's the process here? I think, yeah, sometimes we get stuck in well, I don't want to stick my nose in somebody else's business. That's a myth that we were taught when we were kids.
Yeah.
What happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. Don't gossip. That's not our business. And as I got to adulthood, I had these like firecracker bombs of realization go off that like, oh my God, like that neighbor was in an abusive relationship. And we were just taught to turn our blind eye. It's a very traditional
Absolutely.
way of thinking. Yeah.
Um, this conversation has been extremely helpful, I think, for people listening, to identify different things and access some help. I want to kind of shift our conversation to you, actually, starting with what is something that this type of work has taught you?
Oh, so much. Do not judge a book by its cover. I know it's
Yeah.
such a cliche thing to say, but oh my gosh, yeah. So I just had a very naive way of looking at the world when I first came in. And so both senses of the word working with both victims and perpetrators. So I had this like high anxiety working with perpetrators. They were actually my favorite population to work with because there was a lot of realization and insight, not always, but more often than not with the perpetrators that were like, holy crap, I grew up in this. I didn't
Mhm.
realize this was my belief. Like I started to look at everybody and say, not everybody, sorry, most people, and say like at one point in their life, they were a 4-year-old. And so what happened? Who were they before the world
Yeah.
told them who to be, or the world taught them how to be, or their parents did, or like nobody comes out of the womb going, I really want to be in an abusive relationship, or I'd really love to start being abusive. It's all
Hmm.
things that we're taught. And so if we can have that kind of open mind and you can level with people that like, yeah, you were 4. Who were you when you were 4? You see this whole different human side of them. And I'm not saying everybody, I am saying
Yeah.
most of the people I worked with or work with too. Um, what has it taught me? Um, the big one was to look at my own trauma. When I first started doing domestic violence treatment programming, I was like, oh no, my relationship's different. No, that's never happened to me that bad. Or yeah, it wasn't that severe. Or like I had started like taking
Yeah.
inventory of the relationships I'd been in and then justifying and minimizing because I thought as the therapist I had to be the expert on it or I had to be the all-knowing. And wow, was I humbled quick. I started doing the trauma training and it was like, holy smokes. Yeah. So a lot of the childhood trauma that I had gone through and not just with the traditional beliefs I was raised with. So I obviously had 2 parents who were therapists who were more progressive than a lot of people that I knew. But I also grew up with a very traditional extended family. And some of those beliefs, I had to really find the root of them and challenge them. I have, I had been sexually assaulted from the time I was 2, but I don't remember that, 4 until 23 by various different men. Um, and that I thought, oh, I'm well-rounded. I have a master's degree. I have a career. I was
Right.
married at the time. I had a baby. I'm like, I have it all together. But it was so far from the truth. My trauma response in all the abusive situations I've been in was just keep going, look very functional. And I think that's why one of the myths is you can't tell. And when I tell people like, oh yeah, no, I've been in abusive relationships. I have been sexually assaulted from a very young age all the way into my early 20s. there's this like, well, you have your life together. And I absolutely did not. I used it as a
Mm.
coping mechanism. If I could look well put together, then nobody would see what was behind the curtain.
Right.
So trauma, I
Yeah.
think, has taught me that the most healing thing I find for clients that I work with is knowing that their therapist isn't just reading from a textbook. That in
Right.
some way I am a human who has experienced some of the things that they have.
Yeah, I think the vulnerability is really huge, especially for people going through something, to be able to relate to
Yeah.
the person on the other end of it is really powerful for sure.
Yeah.
What would you say is your favorite part of what you do?
Oh, all of it. Um, recently, because it changes, from like, I don't know, year to year, month to month, recently, I have such a passion for trauma treatment from all different angles. So I am in the process of building a center, and it's going to be a trauma treatment center that incorporates traditional therapy, somatic therapy. I have a Reiki practitioner who does energy work. I want to bring on a chiropractor, a massage therapist, yoga, because trauma is stored in our body, and not just recent trauma, trauma from throughout our whole life. And so we have to find different ways that we can help release that trauma and process it. And traditional therapy is great. Um, but there's a whole other kind of body experience we have to go through. Um, so right now I'm kind of like, my specialty is inner childhood work, and I absolutely love it. So connecting your inner child in session. And I've had just the most beautiful experiences with clients where they like can see their inner child again, and they can laugh with them or play with them or cry with them if they need to. And every time there's just this like, I'm just so happy for
Yeah,
them. Yeah.
yeah. Do you have any favorite trauma resources that you like to recommend?
Okay, so I thought this was a last minute one I looked at too, and I thought, oh, wow. It's an oldie but a goodie. Anything to do with, and I don't know if it's specifically trauma treatment, but it's the Circle of Security. So it's a number of articles and videos out of the UK. It's something I use in all of the programs we run. And it talks about like where we sit as parents and children at the time that we are kids in the circle of security, and where parents um should stand, where we want to aim to be as parents. And then when I bring this forward, a lot of times my clients are like, well, my parents weren't like that at all. And so then there's identification of trauma or attachment trauma. So anything to do with circle of security, love. And then broad, but like Google Eric Gentry. So I did my training, my trauma training on the course that he put on, and he is absolutely fantastic. I just love that he challenges the traditional idea of, say, PTSD, that it's not just soldiers going to war, not just, sorry, that it's not only soldiers going to war, that it's
Right.
also people who have been through continuous attachment trauma. Or when you look at complex PTSD, he also challenges the stigma that comes with borderline personality disorder. And I love that too. So anything Eric Gentry, just Google his videos, and he's very captivating. He's not boring to watch at all.
Amazing. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Again, this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Is there anything else you would like to share with the listeners before we close?
I can't think of anything. If you have any questions, like, just call me. I am such an open book. Like I said, I'll have conversations. If you're not ready to come to programming or therapy yet, but you have questions, there was something in the podcast that you were like, oh, well, maybe I should, ask somebody about that, or maybe this is a dysfunction or abuse happening. Call. I will not always answer because I'm chasing around a 1-year-old and an 8-year-old, but I will get back to you as soon as I
Yeah.
can. And if you have a moment where you're like, is my relationship dysfunctional? It might be. It doesn't mean it's doomed or it's going to turn into violence. Um, but nobody's relationship is perfect. And so if we can
Very
catch it, the earlier, the better.
I think that's a really great message to end on, actually. Thank you again for being on the show today. If anyone wants more information about Rachel and her work, you can see our show notes. The Breaking Free Foundation offers therapy grants for trauma survivors in Alberta, and we also host 2 free support meetings a month. One is in person in Calgary, and one is online. For more information on trauma therapy and our organization, please visit us online at breakingfreefoundation.ca. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share. That's all for now. Stay well.